Hello, it's Just a Party, and today I'm bringing you my top 5 Innistrad Midnight Hunt cards for competitive Commander. So the set's officially out and all that, and people are starting to crack packs. So what cards would I be looking for any CEDH decks? Well, without further ado, let's get into the list. But I'm going to start off with an honorable mention, that being the Beathook Massacre. Probably one of the most expensive cards in the set right now. It is a very strong card. The issue that keeps it off the list is that it really only goes into one real CEDH deck right now. That being Aristocrat-style decks, and the only one that's really on the database right now is Yawgmoth's Physician. While that deck is neat and very fun, I might add, it is not the strongest of decks out there. And this isn't going to make huge steps into making that deck like a tier 1 meta threat or anything. It's really neat that the deck has a flexible board nuke that's also a pinger for the Undying combo, but the deck already had quite a few pingers. This is another good one, but it's not really pushing the deck any further than it already is. So, cool card, not good enough for the top 5. Let's move on to the actual list with number 5, Rite of Harmony. So, Glimpse of Nature is already a very powerful card, and this is another card in that vein. While having one Glimpse of Nature is strong, I think that with 2 now that you can use, there might be some interesting build space that you can do with this card. The big problem with this is that I don't know what deck actually wants to use this. Unlike the Beathook Massacre, which has a obvious place for it, this card doesn't really have a obvious place, but I think once it does eventually find that, it will be a very strong pick for whatever type of weird green-white creature or enchantment deck that wants to use it. But without further ado, let's move on to number 4, Cathar Commando. What can I say? It's another Caustic Caterpillar. Caustic Caterpillar is already a phenomenal card in specific CEDH decks, but it's not like a very fringe card. I've seen this type of effect in many other decks, and this one has the upside of having Flash. So what this card is going to be used in is a lot of more creature style or low-colored white decks to be able to use as spot removal for nasty stacks pieces or maybe like reanimation enchantments. And the fact that it is a creature means that it's something that can be tutored into play off of something like Eldritch Evolution or Worldly Tutor, but that doesn't really tutor it into play. But the fact that it is a creature allows it to be really flexible for dealing with very specific corner stacks pieces. So I think this is going to be a very strong card. Let's move on here to number 3, Fateful Absence. White removal at instant speed. It has been so long since there's been a good one of these, and this one takes quite a lot of boxes for good white removal. While it isn't as good as, say, Swords to Plowshares when it comes to premium removal, this card does something that's really interesting in its flexibility, that being it destroys target creature or planeswalker. So if you're dealing with something like too much Jeska, too much Tevesh Zazat, Teferi, Master of Time, Oko, this card also hits that. The flexibility part of it probably won't come up a ton, but the fact that it has that flexibility with minimal downside, giving your opponent a clue token isn't usually going to help them all too much, because then they have to use 2 mana, and in CEDH that's not the easiest thing to do, depending on what deck they're doing. So I think Fateful Absence is a very strong card that is going to see a lot of play in very low-color white decks that were kind of missing this kind of interaction before. Especially mono-white, they're going to love this card. But let's move on to number 2, Lear, Disciple of the Drowned. Now this is a very interesting one because it's being used as both a commander in High Tide builds and as a reanimation target, also as like the lovely background art would show. I've also seen it being used in conjunction with Oath of Druids, a vintage staple that, well, not staple, a vintage deck that on upkeep it triggers to, if you have less creatures than your opponent, to search through your deck until you hit a creature and then mill everything you hit along the way. So it's sort of being used as a one-card combo to search up Leer, which can then flashback all of the cards that hit yard before, which allows for some interesting shenanigans with stuff like Underworld Breach. I think that there's a lot of build space to work with this card, and whether it being a card that's excellent in the 99 or at the helm of its own deck, I think we're going to be hearing quite a lot more from Leer in the future. But on to the final card, if you haven't guessed it already, Malevolent Hermit and Benevolent Geist. Okay, it's a second Grand Abolisher. It's not as good as Grand Abolisher, but the fact that on the front half it is a counterspell and on the back half it prevents your non-creatures from being countered means that I'm pretty sure this is going to see a lot of play in a lot of different decks. I don't think it's going to see play in the same number of decks as Grand Abolisher, because Grand Abolisher is pretty much good in any deck that you can shove it in. If you're in white, you're probably shoving Grand Abolisher in. Malevolent Hermit is a interesting take on this card. Where I feel like this card's going to see a ton of play is more mid-range control shells, because it isn't Grand Abolisher, because you can't just cast the Grand Abolisher half of the card. You have to put it on field and then wait out till you get to use the Grand Abolisher effect. But it's really neat because on the front half it's an effective counterspell. It's sort of 3 mana for it, but if you can do that, you're getting a better miscast. But for all intents and purposes, I feel as though this is going to be the card I'm going to see the most in different CEDH decks going forward. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have an excellent day.